So, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's podcast. The topic today is to discuss the importance of metadata within the AEC. Why is it important? What role does it play? And what value does it bring as it relates to managing a project and the information therein? So, I'm Joe Giegerich. I'm the CEO and founder of ProjectReady. And with me today is Shaili Modi-Oza, who is the head of development. And as I refer to it, the mother of ProjectReady. Now, the reason why we're talking about metadata today is metadata is just central and part and parcel with the secret sauce of our product, Project Ready. The way that we bind everything to a unique key, typically a project or facility ID, and achieve a scalable taxonomy so that you can get a better handle on the management of project information. And ultimately, what that means in terms of your pocket, right? Less rework, less litigation. Shaylee, this is the general, topic today. But let's just start with this. What is metadata and why is it important for the AEC?
Sure. With metadata, I think we can start with what role does metadata play, and we can refer to it as metadata. They are essentially properties or categories or tags or things with which you can categorize different things. So we can have metadata, all the different aspects that are there as a part of a project would need metadata. There would be metadata at the project level down to the individual documents would need metadata as well to basically categorize the items that would help us define what the different properties are for the project, for the documents, any activities that go on for the project. It just makes all of that data so much better when it's categorized using all of these metadata properties. So I think at a highest level, it just makes the categorization and classification of the data much more manageable by tagging everything with metadata.
All right. I mean, so metadata is throughout our product. In fact, I would argue, Shaylee, that the way Project Ready works is it starts with one unique piece of metadata. In our case, typically it's the project ID, by
Mm.
which all these other categorizations can then get a nice tight hierarchy and roll up to it. So just even taking a step back from all of this, I mean, it really is about project information management at the end of the day. And the only way you can manage information in the AEC is with metadata because of the unique challenges, right? And those challenges are you're working in your system, other people's systems, you're consuming data and documents and information typically across a stack, from the M365 stack, SharePoint, to Procore, to Autodesk Cloud. So if you can just take it from that context, why should the industry care about metadata in that regard?
Yeah, going back to where Project Ready starts everything with our
But even
project
agnostic of
ID.
project ready,
Okay,
right?
okay. Hmm.
Just on an industry level,
Hmm.
and I'll add even one more thing to it. What we
Hmm.
find is before we come in, generally, it's glaringly absent, right? Because what are you doing about metadata on a spreadsheet you have siloed? What are you doing about documents that are just, shoved into the out of the box library in SharePoint document folder inside ACC. And so, do you agree with that much at least? Is that very commonly metadata, and I guess more importantly, universal metadata, a way to connect that all together is pretty wanting once you go outside one CDE. Is that a fair
Definitely.
statement?
All the different CDEs have their own set of properties and how the metadata is defined. So there is that separation as well in terms of the multiple CDEs at the project level, where each CDE would have its own set of properties and metadata, and it's hard to kind of manage the documents. And in some cases, as you mentioned, Joe, they don't even have that level of classification. The documents are just dropped into folder structures, be it in a single library in SharePoint or in just files, folder structures across ACC, Procore. Things are
Which is
just the only classification is that it's in this folder, doesn't
right, which
have
is a
any
poor
additional.
man's metadata, right? But it's
That's
not
correct.
fungible.
Hmm.
It's the industry is besieged with silos. Naming a folder just complicates that matter because there's no way to scrape that data. There's no way to put that into a relational database by which you can map and make sense. Fair?
That's correct. And in all of these CDEs, it doesn't really help to search for a document based on the folder it is in. So that makes that really difficult to find and classify these documents as well in like a long run.
Yeah, we handle that through what we refer to, folks, as master metadata. So we have metadata, as Shaili was pointing out, on the project level itself, on the tasks and the deliverables, but also this layer of, as we again refer to it as master metadata, by which you have metadata that, regardless of where that content sits, you can catalog it, right? You can get a
Mhm,
document register, if you will, with a consistent set of metadata, be it that document exists in SharePoint or ACC or Procore or Box.
mhm. Yeah, that's correct. So the metadata, it can be tagged at right from the project level. The metadata can be associated with the different workflows in the system as well. So if you're doing an RFI, there can be metadata that is specific to the RFI. And for all of the document control workflows, at the document level, the metadata can be stored and it can be basically the source of truth kind of a thing where it doesn't matter where the data is going, the metadata stays consistent. And that can be defined at the project level. And the consistent metadata stays with the documents, irrespective of where the document ends up in any CDE.
Yeah, and consistency in this case is not the hobgoblin of little minds. It's the absolute only way that you can really start to piece together and ultimately manage project information. Right? You have to find some consistency and some way to connect. Right?
Mhm.
Two things. One is, how do you approach metadata in all these systems, both within the context of our product and generally, I guess, as a methodology. And, and how does that facilitate, once you got that right, how does that facilitate decision making and reducing risk and rework? If you could talk to that.
Yeah, I would start with specifically when we begin the approach and start defining what metadata makes sense for a business or an organization. We start with the use case and the end result for all of the metadata and the properties is that we can have robust reporting and searching of the data that has been categorized. So it would be the best place to start on what are the different properties that make sense
That are
for
important.
your business, yeah, that are important and which would help with the reporting and giving all of the valuable reporting aspects from that metadata, be it document registry with what are all the different categories or properties with the documents or drawings, irrespective of what CDE they live in as end users, what are the different properties that make sense. And that is where we generally start and then basically start defining what the standards should be, what the different properties should be for the document. And then once the properties are defined at the project level, they just hierarchically flow through that. If there's a property at the project level, it can automatically just flow through for the document because that document lives in the project. So it just kind of makes sense as we start defining and working with companies to just ensure that we have that initial layer or initial set of metadata properties that make the most sense.
Well, when it comes to trying to figure out what the right set of information is, the right meta values, it's not pretty much any one person. I mean, the I would argue the point and purpose of having a scalable taxonomy around metadata is that each discipline has their different axe to grind. I mean, it's why you have so many silos. If you're a designer, and working in BIM 360, you have an absolutely distinct set of needs around that information that you're working with and generating versus somebody in Procore or PlanGrid. So the fact that it takes dozens of disciplines and trades to create a built object is really what's creating in large measure or exacerbating the data silos, right? Because they all have their own bespoke purposes or specialties, just like the trades have specialties, just like design teams and build teams. So if you want to establish, at the beginning, you're trying to figure out, how you're going to build this coherent taxonomy. You really have to talk to, or at least have subject matter experts in a variety of these roles that they may sit in. Do you agree with that, Shelley?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's what makes it difficult for organizations to come up with that standard. Or it's a lot of different teams and a lot of different processes across a single organization. Taking that time and defining that metadata in a longer run makes it so much better in terms of the eventual end result of the project, and just managing that project becomes that much easier. And it could be each department could have their own set of properties and metadata, and the way they are using the metadata values could differ wildly, but at the end it just all comes together for the project.
Yeah, and exponentially on a project, there's your systems, your internal team, and it's just extremely compounded by the fact that you now have to accommodate data from systems in other organizations' systems.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, but the one thing I will say is that at the end of the day, at least again, I like your opinion on this, is the industry does have, however, a reasonable set of nomenclature and terms as a starting point. Um, even down to the pedestrian request for information, that workflow itself has some generalized standards as to how it's managed, right? Same
Mhm.
thing with submittals, et cetera.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct. They all have responses and status codes that need to be categorized properly, and it definitely has that in place.
And to make it powerful enough to really manage that information, that's where metadata comes in. So the workflow, we know what an RFI is, ball and cord, all those kind of term sets. But bringing it together across those teams and systems is where metadata comes in. So uh, that's the devil in the details, but the details that really drive home that ROI. But there is at least, I think, a generalized starting point within the industry. And I would argue that, and I've witnessed, this is something the industry on whole, I believe, is starting to try to move toward some at least more universal standards. Yeah, and for us, it's the project ID or the facility ID. And the way I always looked at it at the beginning of this whole process was, particularly, if you're an owner, it's the facility. If you're a vendor, the project ID is usually the PO. And so, everybody, despite skills and passion for their profession, are looking to, eat and have housing and all that good stuff. So by using that project ID, we always thought that, or the facility ID, that's what made it sacrosanct. And to pick up on something that you had said as well, you mentioned search. So, and again, in our own case, with everything bound to that project ID and everything cascading and then universality of descriptors across these CDEs, search becomes super powerful and has a unique value given that you're able to search for content across these different repositories as long as it flowed through, the transaction, regardless of where they live. And so that search of a different, horse of a different color, there's a search of a different color where it's not your traditional like Google search or even a SharePoint search. It's searching within the context of a transaction, be it a submittal, an RFI, and then subsequently, the way we have this very scalable taxonomy lets us find direct links to those documents, right? And so that becomes part of the power of metadata. But I would argue that the one of the big challenges, again, that we think we solve for is how do you do that on scale, right? So you have this great mapping, you know what you want to describe, but how do you get that to scale really requires a fair bit of plumbing after the fact. It's all about scalable taxonomy, and you can't scale if you don't have a coherent structure to all this. So the other question is then, so now that you have this, you mentioned search and the like, what other benefits are there of having a scalable hierarchical taxonomy as it relates to metadata. So we know it makes it classification of data consistent.
Mhm.
But how do you think that helps reduce risk?
Yeah, the classification and searching and reporting are definitely something that would be an ongoing thing. But in terms of just a day-to-day use case kind of feature, let's say all the documents across multiple projects, the users need to have that information of a lot of different things going on what who the document is, let's say, assigned to, what are the different statuses that the documents are, and all of the custom metadata properties that we've talked about, that like the different classifications based on what region or facilities, just some examples of different metadata properties that this can be tagged with. But I would think that the most powerful thing would be that just at a portfolio level across all the projects, you need something that is rolling up some sort of uh, day-to-day view of everything that's going on across projects, across CDEs, and having the metadata properties along with it would just give that full view or the full picture of what's going on across the projects. Right now, what we've been seeing is that all of these processes are very disconnected. There is an Excel that has been that gets maintained separately, where people are manually updating different statuses and who is working on what. The documents themselves live somewhere else, and then the project and the project information is in a third place. So it makes that very hard to manage
Right,
because
it's all
all of that
siloed.
is, yeah, all of that is siloed and it's all separate, and it's just very difficult to bring that all together just by kind of having these metadata tags for projects and documents and different features, and just putting it all in one place makes that much more manageable, and it makes like the day-to-day activities, I think, much more efficient.
Yeah, and so efficiency is a big part of it. I'm all about ROI. There's no part of technology that anybody will fund unless it's improving their bottom line. And
Mhm.
so, you know, so that single source of truth. You need a single source of truth across all these different systems so you can make informed decisions. The reason why you want to make those informed decisions is to reduce risk, and that risk comes in a few, two or three ways, right? Primarily is rework and litigation, right? So you have to make sure that this drawing is complete out of ACC, that the owner has in their SharePoint, that the people in the field using Procore or PlanGrid are all looking at that one version of the truth, that one specific document. And if they're not, it's kind of funny to
Mhm.
me and ironic that the built world is about all connecting these different systems as it relates to a building, like HVAC and your exterior and your foundation. But within the industry's ability to manage all the information that ultimately leads to that built world object, that's all siloed. And subsequently, those wrong plans can make a building collapse or a bridge collapse. Or story I always tell is at a Microsoft conference, geez, years ago in Boston, and they just opened the tunnel and that collapsed. And it turned out, there was this problem, there was that problem, but it all could have been solved if there was an easy way to get a coherent view of what's going on, what was being built, was it being built to spec. And so you see these kind of failures routinely on the basis of that inability to bring stuff together. So the purpose of metadata ultimately is to make sense of information that's across phases and actors and all that other stuff and drive your bottom line, right? Which is the reduction of rework and litigation.
Yep, definitely agreed.
And Shaili, we have a lot of customers using the system. One of the clients that comes to mind is to Craft, uh, manufacturer in Germany, heavy equipment, et cetera. But they use our document control suite, DC Next, very heavily. How does metadata come into play? Because they're going to be sending up to 6 million documents a year through the system. How does metadata help them in that process? Because that's an onerous thing, right? So how many document control packages are they issuing? How many
Mhm.
documents? 6 million documents across a year. That's a lot to handle. How does the use of metadata in the way we've implemented in DC Next within Project Ready, how does metadata help that client?
So in terms of, yeah, definitely with the craft, they are sending this huge volume of documents out with our document control suite, and we have metadata set for them with a whole lot of different workflows, starting from registering the content which comes in externally from vendors. So what this would do is whenever vendors are submitting documents, it forces them to add all of the different metadata properties and tag all the documents correctly. And then that metadata along with the documents would flow through as the document gets reviewed and approved and goes through the next stages in the project. And they have at least 25 different properties that are tagged with the documents, and all of this across projects helps them to create this master document registry of all the different documents in the different stages of approvals and review, and they can have this global view at a portfolio level across projects of the status of all of these different documents. And because there are so many thousands of documents, it all of these metadata properties that consistently have been kind of flowing through right from the initial stage where the documents come in from the vendors to then it goes through an approval process. It just helps maintain that overall list, and it gives them a clear view to just see what's going on at the portfolio level.
Yeah, and even like so, one of our features is the registration of content. I believe they use that feature as well.
Hmm.
So the use case, my understanding is they have a myriad of vendors working for them that have to submit what are they PDF drawings primarily.
Hmm. Yes, correct.
So from the get go, with our master metadata and our document control suite, the vendor themselves will be corralled into using a consistent set of descriptors. I mean, we've seen this in a lot of clients where every vendor sends them a spreadsheet with some register with their own language designed for twins, right? And so by pleasantly, if you will, forcing a standard on those outside vendors who are contributing to the project right out of the gate, they're able to make a lot more sense of all this documentation, these millions of records that they have to manage. And without that, in a spreadsheet and a file system, I mean, you're just doomed. Fair enough. I mean, how would you really know until something went desperately wrong?
Yeah, definitely. It was very manual before, and like you said, people send different metadata properties maintained in Excel files all over the place. Just very difficult to keep track of all of these documents. This gives a very good standard that this is the standard we are following. These are the metadata properties that these documents need to be set with. And then across different projects, different vendors, it creates that standard set of SOP, and that just increases efficiency at a great level.
Oh, yeah, that was the other thing I forgot to pick up on as well is efficiency, right? So,
Hmm.
yes, there's rework and the risk of litigation. There's how long are you taking to brute force these processes? And again, the irony is that metadata is being used, but just not in a way that traverses different systems and stages and vendors and all that other stuff. So everybody knows they have to describe these things, even in the very old school and not good way of naming folders with these long paragraph names, 256 characters. That's all attempts at metadata, but it's not scalable. And at scale, at that point, uh, what was taking you a day probably takes you half an hour. All right. Well, we've taken up a lot of your time today, but I hope some of this was informative. Very passionate about the product, very passionate about efficiency. And metadata from the beginning is really where we've been focusing as we continue to develop and enhance and innovate in terms of what we do for the industry. So, hope to have you back on the next podcast. I want to thank everybody for their time today, and you'll hear from us the next time. Thank you.
Thank you.